The lodging house on Westport Street looked like any other in Edinburgh's Irish Quarter during the winter of 1828. A narrow, three-story building of weathered grey stone, it pressed close against its neighbours in the crowded tenement district that housed the city's poorest immigrants. The painted sign above the door read, "Hare's Lodging House, clean beds, fair prices," but locals knew it better as a place where desperate people could find shelter without questions asked. What none of them suspected was that in the back room of this unremarkable building, Burke and William Hare had perfected a murder technique so efficient it left no marks on the victims. They called it Burking, a method of suffocation that preserved the body's value for medical dissection while generating profits that exceeded anything these Irish labourers could have earned through honest work. Edinburgh in 1828 stood at the pinnacle of medical education in Europe, attracting students from across Britain and the continent to study at its prestigious medical school. The city's reputation for anatomical instruction was built on the expertise of professors like Dr. Robert Knox, whose dramatic lectures in the anatomy theatre drew standing-room-only crowds of eager medical students. But this excellence in medical education created an insatiable demand for human corpses, a commodity that was both legally restricted and practically essential for proper anatomical training. The law governing body procurement for medical education was both archaic and inadequate for the needs of a modern medical school. Legal dissection was limited to the bodies of executed criminals, a supply that provided perhaps 3 or 4 corpses per year for an institution that needed hundreds. This created a thriving black market in human remains, dominated by professional grave robbers known as resurrection men, who would exhume recently buried bodies and sell them to medical schools for substantial profits. Burke and William Hare had initially planned to enter the resurrection trade when they recognized the financial opportunity presented by Edinburgh's medical schools. Burke, a 35-year-old labourer from Ulster, had come to Edinburgh seeking work in the construction trade, but found only sporadic employment that barely supported his common-law wife Helen MacDougall. Hare, slightly younger at 30, operated the Westport lodging house with his wife Margaret after the death of the previous owner, whose widow Margaret had quickly married to maintain control of the property. The partnership between Burke and Hare began in late 1827 when one of the lodging house tenants, an elderly pensioner named Donald, died of natural causes while owing substantial rent money. Rather than simply disposing of the body through normal channels, Hare suggested they might recover the debt by selling Donald's corpse to the medical school. The idea appealed to Burke's practical nature, and together they transported the body to Surgeons Square, where they received £7 from Dr. Knox's assistant for their unusual merchandise. The transaction was so straightforward and profitable that it immediately suggested new possibilities to both men. £7 represented more money than either could earn in a month of legitimate labour, and the medical school's representatives had asked no awkward questions about how they had obtained such a fresh, undamaged corpse. If they could repeat this transaction regularly, they could escape the grinding poverty that had characterized their entire adult lives. The problem, of course, was that tenants did not die with convenient frequency, and waiting for natural deaths would never provide the steady income stream that Burke and Hare began to envision. Within weeks of their first successful body sale, they had begun discussing more proactive methods of ensuring a reliable supply of marketable corpses. The transition from opportunistic body selling to systematic murder happened gradually, almost imperceptibly, as economic incentives overwhelmed moral constraints. Their first deliberate victim was Joseph Miller, another elderly tenant at Hare's lodging house, who had been suffering from fever for several days. Miller was weak, isolated and unlikely to be missed by anyone in Edinburgh's anonymous immigrant community. More importantly, his continued illness was keeping other potential tenants away from the lodging house, reducing Hare's legitimate income. The decision to hasten Miller's death seemed almost like a practical business solution rather than murder. The method they developed for killing Joseph Miller would become the signature technique that eventually gave rise to the term Burking. Rather than using violence that might damage the corpse and reduce its value, Burke and Hare discovered that they could suffocate victims by covering their nose and mouth while pressing down on their chest to prevent breathing. The technique required two people working in coordination, but it left no visible marks on the body and could be performed quickly and quietly in the privacy of the lodging house. Joseph Miller's murder was accomplished without difficulty, and his body sold to Dr. Knox for the same £7 they had received for Donald's naturally deceased corpse. The transaction convinced both men that they had discovered a sustainable business model that could provide regular income far exceeding anything available through legitimate employment. More importantly, they had learned that Dr. Knox's representatives were completely uninterested in investigating the source of their merchandise, focusing only on the freshness and condition of the bodies they purchased. The success of their first planned murder led Burke and Hare to begin systematically identifying potential victims among Edinburgh's most vulnerable residents. They targeted individuals who were isolated, friendless, and unlikely to be missed if they disappeared. Elderly pensioners, vagrant laborers, and prostitutes became their preferred victims, people whose absence from the city's streets would not prompt investigation by authorities or concern from family members. Margaret Hare and Helen MacDougall quickly became essential partners in the murder operation, though their exact level of knowledge about the systematic nature of the crimes remains historically debated. Both women participated in luring victims to the lodging house, providing them with alcohol, and creating the social atmosphere that made the murders possible. Whether they fully understood that they were facilitating deliberate killings or believed they were simply helping with an expanded body-snatching operation was never definitively established during the subsequent legal proceedings. The lodging house on West Port Street was perfectly suited to their criminal enterprise. The building's layout included a back room that was isolated from the main living areas, providing privacy for their activities. The transient nature of the lodging house's clientele meant that new faces were constantly appearing and disappearing, making it difficult for anyone to track who had stayed there and when they had left. Most importantly, the neighborhood's poverty and social chaos meant that authorities paid little attention to the comings and goings of Irish immigrants. Robert Knox, the primary purchaser of Burke and Hare's bodies, was one of Edinburgh's most prominent anatomists and a controversial figure in the city's medical community. At 37 years old, Knox had established a reputation for brilliant teaching and innovative research, but also for arrogance and disregard for conventional medical ethics. His anatomy lectures were theatrical performances that combined scientific education with entertainment, drawing audiences that included not only medical students, but also curious members of the general public. Knox's approach to acquiring bodies for his anatomical demonstrations was pragmatic rather than scrupulous. He paid premium prices for fresh corpses and asked no questions about their origin, creating a powerful financial incentive for body suppliers to provide exactly what he needed. His assistants, particularly David Patterson, handled the actual transactions with Burke and Hare, maintaining a degree of separation between Knox and the criminal activities that supplied his anatomy theatre. The relationship between Knox and his body suppliers was based on mutual benefit and deliberate ignorance. Knox needed fresh corpses for his teaching and research, while Burke and Hare needed a reliable buyer who would pay good prices without investigating their methods. Neither party had any incentive to examine too closely the arrangements that made their partnership so profitable. This willful blindness to obvious criminal activity would eventually become one of the most controversial aspects of the entire case. Burke and Hare's second planned murder involved an elderly English woman known only as Abigail Simpson, who had been staying at various lodging houses in the Westport area while searching for work as a domestic servant. Simpson was perfect for their purposes. She was alone in Edinburgh, had no local family or friends, and was desperate enough for shelter that she would readily accept their invitation to stay at Hare's lodging house for a reduced rate. The murder of Abigail Simpson followed the same pattern they had established with Joseph Miller. She was provided with free alcohol until she became intoxicated and defenseless, then killed using their suffocation technique in the privacy of the back room. Her body was delivered to Dr. Knox's anatomy school the following morning, where it was received without comment or question. The £10 they received for Simpson's corpse represented a slight increase in their prices, suggesting that Dr. Knox's operation was willing to pay premium rates for particularly fresh specimens. The success of their second murder convinced Burke and Hare that they had indeed developed a sustainable and profitable criminal enterprise. They began to think of themselves as businessmen rather than criminals, providing a valuable service to Edinburgh's medical community while generating income that lifted them out of the poverty that had previously defined their lives. This psychological transformation from desperate laborers to successful entrepreneurs was crucial in enabling them to continue and expand their murder operations. Their third victim was a young Englishman named John Davidson, who had come to Edinburgh seeking work in the growing construction industry. Davidson represented a slight departure from their previous target profile because he was younger and healthier than their elderly victims, but his isolation and lack of local connections made him an attractive target. His murder also allowed them to test whether Dr. Knox's operation would pay the same prices for younger bodies, which proved to be the case. The murder of John Davidson introduced new elements to Burke and Hare's methodology. Because Davidson was stronger and more alert than their previous victims, they needed to be more careful about timing and execution. They discovered that providing victims with laudanum-laced alcohol was more effective than simple intoxication for rendering them helpless. They also learned that younger victims required more careful handling during the suffocation process to avoid leaving marks that might raise questions. By the spring of 1828, Burke and Hare had established a routine that allowed them to murder victims approximately once every 2 weeks, generating a steady income that far exceeded anything they could have earned through legitimate employment. Their success had also attracted the attention of other criminal elements in Edinburgh's underground economy, though they were careful to maintain secrecy about their specific methods and business relationships. The transformation of Burke and Hare from petty criminals to systematic murderers was facilitated by the complete absence of effective law enforcement oversight in Edinburgh's immigrant neighbourhoods. The city's police force was small, understaffed, and focused primarily on protecting the property and safety of respectable citizens rather than investigating crimes against the poor and marginalised. The death or disappearance of vagrant laborers and elderly pensioners simply did not register as significant events requiring investigation. The medical community's willingness to purchase bodies without investigating their source was equally crucial to Burke and Hare's success. The competitive pressure among Edinburgh's anatomy schools to provide superior educational experiences for their students created a market environment where freshness and quality of specimens were the only relevant considerations. Questions about legality or ethics were subordinated to the practical needs of medical education. Knox's Anatomy Theatre became the primary destination for Burke and Hare's victims, though they occasionally sold bodies to other medical schools when Knox's operation was overstocked or when they wanted to avoid creating suspicion through too frequent transactions with a single buyer. The Anatomy Theatre itself was an impressive space designed to showcase both the drama and scientific rigor of anatomical education. Rising tiers of seats surrounded a central dissection table where Knox would perform demonstrations for audiences that could exceed 100 observers. The process of anatomical dissection in Knox's theatre was both educational and entertainment, reflecting the era's fascination with scientific discovery and medical advancement. Knox's lectures combined detailed explanation of human anatomy with theatrical presentation, making complex medical concepts accessible to students while maintaining audience engagement through dramatic techniques. The freshness of the corpses provided by Burke and Hare was essential to these presentations, as decomposing bodies were both unpleasant and educationally less valuable. Burke and Hare's success in avoiding detection for nearly a year was due partly to their careful selection of victims and partly to the social conditions that made certain types of people effectively invisible to Edinburgh's authorities. Their victims were drawn from the ranks of society's most marginalized members: elderly pensioners with no family connections, vagrant laborers seeking temporary work, prostitutes working in the city's poorest neighborhoods, and immigrants who had no local social networks. The psychological evolution of Burke and Hare during their months of systematic murder reveals how ordinary individuals can become capable of extraordinary evil when economic incentives align with social circumstances that minimize consequences. Neither man had shown previous signs of violent tendencies or psychopathic behavior. They were simply poor, desperate and practical men who discovered a business opportunity that required them to overcome normal moral constraints. The relationship between Burke and Hare remained primarily business-focused throughout their criminal partnership, though they developed the trust and coordination necessary for their collaborative murders. Burke was generally considered the more intelligent and articulate of the two, while Hare provided the infrastructure and local knowledge necessary for their operations. Both men understood that their success depended on maintaining secrecy and avoiding any activities that might attract official attention. Their criminal enterprise was not conducted in complete isolation, however. Margaret Hare and Helen McDougall were essential participants in creating the social situations that made the murders possible. Other residents of the lodging house and neighborhood were aware that Burke and Hare had access to unusual amounts of money, though most assumed they were involved in some form of illegal but non-violent activity such as smuggling or theft. The systematic nature of Burke and Hare's murder operation becomes most apparent when examining the individual cases of their victims, each carefully selected and methodically killed according to patterns that reveal the calculated business logic underlying their crimes. Over the course of 10 months in 1828, they murdered at least 16 people, though some historians suggest the actual number may have been higher, with additional victims whose disappearances were never connected to the Westport murders. Mary Patterson represented a significant departure from Burke and Hare's previous victim profile and marked the beginning of their most productive and dangerous period. Unlike their earlier victims, who had been elderly or infirm, Mary was a young, attractive and well-known prostitute who worked in the Canongate area of Edinburgh. At 25 years old, she was healthy, strong, and had regular clients who would notice her absence. Her selection as a victim demonstrated Burke and Hare's growing confidence in their methods and their willingness to accept increased risks for higher profits. Mary Patterson's murder was also their most socially significant crime because it resulted in their first direct interaction with Edinburgh's medical student community. When her body appeared on Dr. Knox's dissection table, several students recognized her immediately, having encountered her in the city's taverns and brothels. The recognition created uncomfortable questions about how such a recently alive and familiar person had ended up as an anatomical specimen, questions that Dr. Knox deflected with authoritative explanations about the efficiency of the city's body procurement systems. The murder of Mary Patterson occurred in April 1828, when Burke encountered her drinking in a tavern near the Grassmarket. Using the social skills he had developed for targeting victims, Burke engaged her in conversation and eventually invited her to continue drinking at his lodgings, promising better quality alcohol and more comfortable surroundings. Mary accepted the invitation, possibly because Burke's appearance and manner suggested he had money to spend on entertainment. The actual murder followed the established pattern that Burke and Hare had perfected with their previous victims. Mary was provided with alcohol laced with laudanum until she lost consciousness, then killed using their suffocation technique in the back room of the lodging house. However, her murder required more careful handling because her youth and health made the suffocation process more difficult and time-consuming than it had been with elderly or infirm victims. Mary Patterson's body was delivered to Dr. Knox's anatomy school the morning after her murder, where it was purchased for £10 without question or investigation. The transaction proceeded exactly as their previous body sales had, with Dr. Knox's assistants focusing only on the quality and freshness of the specimen rather than its source. However, the recognition of Mary by medical students created the first serious threat to Burke and Hare's continued operation. Knox's response to student recognition of Mary Patterson established a pattern of willful ignorance that would characterize his handling of subsequent suspicious cases. When students pointed out that they recognized the body and that the woman had been alive and well just days before, Knox dismissed their concerns with confident assertions about the legal and proper acquisition of all anatomical specimens used in his demonstrations. His authoritative manner and professional reputation were sufficient to silence most questions, though some students remained privately troubled by the obvious implications. The financial success of Mary Patterson's murder encouraged Burke and Hare to target additional victims from Edinburgh's prostitute population, reasoning that these women were accessible, socially marginal, and unlikely to be missed by anyone in a position to investigate their disappearances. Their next victim was Janet Brown, a friend and colleague of Mary Patterson's, who had become suspicious about Mary's sudden disappearance and had been asking questions in the taverns where both women had worked. Janet Brown's investigation into Mary Patterson's disappearance posed a direct threat to Burke and Hare's operation, making her elimination a matter of practical necessity rather than simple profit maximization. Brown had been telling other prostitutes that Mary's disappearance was suspicious and that someone should report it to the authorities. Her murder was therefore both an effort to maintain their criminal enterprise and an attempt to prevent exposure of their previous crimes. The murder of Janet Brown required more elaborate deception than their previous crimes because she was already suspicious and alert to potential danger. Burke and Hare used Margaret Hare and Helen McDougall to approach Brown and convince her that they had information about Mary Patterson's whereabouts. The women's involvement was crucial because Brown would not have trusted Burke or Hare directly, but she was willing to believe that other women might legitimately want to help find her missing friend. Janet Brown was lured to the lodging house under the pretense of meeting someone who had seen Mary Patterson recently and could provide information about where she had gone. Once inside, she was provided with alcohol and gradually rendered unconscious using the same methods that had proven effective with previous victims. Her murder was accomplished without difficulty, and her body was sold to Dr. Knox's anatomy school the following day. The systematic elimination of Janet Brown demonstrated Burke and Hare's evolution from opportunistic criminals to calculating predators who were willing to commit murder to protect their criminal enterprise. The murder also showed their ability to adapt their methods to different circumstances and to use accomplices effectively when direct approaches were not feasible. Most importantly, it revealed their understanding that their criminal operation required active management of potential threats rather than simple reliance on victim selection. James Wilson, known locally as Daft Jamie, represented one of Burke and Hare's most controversial murders because the victim was a well-known and widely recognized figure in Edinburgh's street life. Wilson was an 18-year-old man with intellectual disabilities who supported himself by running errands, delivering messages, and performing simple tasks for Edinburgh residents. His cheerful personality and distinctive appearance made him familiar to hundreds of people throughout the city, making his disappearance far more noticeable than previous victims. The decision to target James Wilson was probably Burke and Hare's most significant tactical error, as his murder would eventually contribute to their exposure and capture. Wilson's intellectual disability made him an easy target for deception and manipulation, but his high visibility in Edinburgh's social networks made his disappearance impossible to ignore. The murder demonstrated the growing recklessness that characterized Burke and Hare's operations as their success bred overconfidence. James Wilson was lured to the lodging house with promises of work and payment for simple tasks. His trusting nature and limited understanding of social dangers made the deception straightforward, but his murder proved more difficult than anticipated because his intellectual disability was accompanied by considerable physical strength. The suffocation process required both Burke and Hare working together for an extended period, and they were forced to use more violent methods than usual to complete the killing. When James Wilson's body appeared on Dr. Knox's dissection table, it was immediately recognized by several medical students who had employed him for various errands and tasks. Unlike Mary Patterson, whose recognition had created primarily gossip and speculation, Wilson's identification as a recent anatomical specimen generated serious questions that could not be dismissed through professional authority alone. Students began discussing among themselves whether they had an obligation to report their concerns to university authorities or civil magistrates. Knox's handling of the James Wilson case revealed the full extent of his willingness to ignore obvious evidence of criminal activity in order to maintain his supply of anatomical specimens. When confronted with undeniable evidence that Wilson had been murdered specifically for anatomical dissection, Knox insisted that all proper procedures had been followed, and that questions about body procurement were outside the scope of medical education. His response satisfied university administrators, but did nothing to address the growing suspicions among students and other members of Edinburgh's medical community. The murder of Margaret Docherty in late October 1828 would prove to be Burke and Hare's final crime, and the catalyst for their eventual exposure and prosecution. Docherty was an elderly Irish woman who had recently arrived in Edinburgh seeking work as a domestic servant. Her selection as a victim was consistent with their previous target profile, but the circumstances of her murder violated several of the operational security principles that had previously protected their criminal enterprise. Margaret Docherty's murder was planned hastily in response to immediate financial pressures rather than following their usual careful preparation and victim assessment procedures. Both Burke and Hare needed money quickly to pay debts and living expenses, and Docherty presented an opportunity for rapid profit generation. However, their rush to complete the murder led to careless planning and execution that would ultimately result in their capture. The murder of Margaret Docherty occurred in Burke's lodgings rather than in Hare's establishment, representing a departure from their usual operational procedures. Burke had invited Docherty to stay in his rooms after meeting her at a tavern, where she had been asking about available work and affordable lodging. The change in location was significant because Burke's neighbors were more familiar with his normal routines and more likely to notice unusual activities. The actual murder of Margaret Doherty followed their established suffocation technique, but it was witnessed by James and Anne Gray, a lodging couple who were staying temporarily in Burke's rooms. The Grays had been sleeping in the same area when they were awakened by sounds of struggle and observed Burke and Hare in the process of killing Doherty. Their presence as witnesses represented a complete breakdown of the operational security that had previously protected Burke and Hare's criminal activities. James and Anne Gray's initial response to witnessing Margaret Doherty's murder was complicated by their own vulnerable social position and their uncertainty about how to report what they had seen. As temporary lodgers dependent on Burke's hospitality, they were reluctant to immediately confront him or report the crime to authorities. However, they were also terrified by what they had witnessed and concerned about their own safety if they remained silent. The disposal of Margaret Doherty's body created additional complications because the Greys' presence meant that Burke and Hare could not follow their usual procedures for transportation to the anatomy school. They were forced to hide the body in the lodging house while attempting to convince the Greys to remain silent about what they had witnessed. This delay provided time for the Greys to overcome their initial shock and fear and to decide that they had a moral obligation to report the murder. The discovery of Margaret Doherty's body in Burke's lodgings led to the immediate arrest of Burke, Hare and their female companions on charges of murder. The arrest occurred when James Gray reported the crime to local authorities, providing detailed testimony about what he and his wife had witnessed. The subsequent investigation would expose the full scope of Burke and Hare's murder operation and reveal the complicity of Edinburgh's medical establishment in their crimes. The pattern of victim selection employed by Burke and Hare reveals the calculated nature of their criminal enterprise and their understanding of Edinburgh's social vulnerabilities. They consistently targeted individuals who were isolated, impoverished, and unlikely to be missed by anyone in a position to investigate their disappearances. Elderly pensioners, vagrant laborers, prostitutes, and individuals with mental disabilities were all overrepresented among their victims because these groups lacked social protection and official concern. The geographic distribution of Burke and Hare's victims was concentrated in Edinburgh's poorest neighbourhoods, particularly the areas around Westport and the Grassmarket, where Irish immigrants and other marginalised populations lived in overcrowded and poorly regulated conditions. These neighbourhoods were characterised by high population turnover, limited police presence and social conditions that made it difficult to track individual residents or investigate their disappearances. The economic calculations underlying Burke and Hare's victim selection were straightforward but chilling in their practicality. Each murder generated approximately £10 in immediate profit, representing several months' wages for unskilled labourers. The victims were selected not for personal reasons or emotional motivations, but purely based on their market value as anatomical specimens and their low probability of generating official investigation if they disappeared. The psychological impact of Burke and Hare's crimes on Edinburgh's marginalised communities was severe and long-lasting, though it was rarely documented in official records. The systematic targeting of vulnerable populations created an atmosphere of fear and suspicion that made it difficult for legitimate social services to function effectively. Elderly pensioners became reluctant to seek shelter in lodging houses, prostitutes avoided potential clients who offered unusual hospitality, and immigrants became suspicious of friendly approaches from strangers. The complicity of Edinburgh's medical establishment in Burke and Hare's crimes was demonstrated not only through Dr. Knox's willful ignorance, but also through the broader institutional failure to investigate the obvious signs of criminal activity. Medical schools throughout the city were purchasing unusually fresh corpses without asking questions about their source, creating a market environment that actively encouraged criminal behavior. The legal and social status of Burke and Hare's victims was a crucial factor in enabling their crimes to continue for as long as they did. Most of their victims were individuals who existed on the margins of legal society, lacking the social connections and institutional protections that would have made their disappearances noticeable to authorities. Their deaths were not considered significant losses by Edinburgh's respectable society, making investigation and prosecution less likely. The arrest of William Burke and William Hare on November 1, 1828, marked the beginning of one of the most sensational criminal cases in Scottish legal history. The discovery of Margaret Docherty's body in Burke's lodgings, following testimony from James and Anne Gray, exposed a murder operation that had been systematically supplying Edinburgh's medical schools with fresh corpses for nearly a year. The subsequent investigation would reveal not only the full scope of Burke and Hare's crimes, but also the willful blindness of Edinburgh's medical establishment to obvious signs of criminal activity. The initial police investigation was led by Lieutenant John Tate of the Edinburgh Police, who had been called to Burke's lodgings by James Gray's report of witnessing a murder. Tate's examination of the scene revealed clear evidence of violent struggle and the presence of Margaret Docherty's body, which had been hastily concealed under bedding in the back room. The condition of the corpse, which showed signs of suffocation but no other obvious injuries, immediately suggested the possibility of systematic murder for anatomical purposes. The arrest of Burke, Hare, Helen MacDougall, and Margaret Hare created immediate complications for the legal authorities because Scottish law required clear evidence of individual guilt rather than collective conspiracy charges. The prosecution would need to prove specific involvement in particular murders rather than simply demonstrating participation in a general criminal enterprise. This legal requirement would eventually lead to the controversial decision to grant immunity to William Hare in exchange for his testimony against Burke. The interrogation of the four suspects revealed significant differences in their willingness to cooperate with authorities and their understanding of the legal consequences they faced. Burke initially denied any involvement in murder while admitting to occasional body-snatching activities, claiming that any corpses he had sold to medical schools had been obtained from legitimate grave-robbing operations. Hare was more forthcoming about their activities, but attempted to minimize his own role while implicating Burke as the primary organizer of their criminal enterprise. The women's testimony proved crucial in establishing the scope and systematic nature of Burke and Hare's murder operation. Helen MacDougall provided detailed information about the timing and methods of several murders, while Margaret Hare confirmed the involvement of both men in multiple killings. However, both women insisted that they had been coerced into participation and had feared for their own safety if they refused to cooperate with the murders. The investigation quickly expanded beyond the immediate case of Margaret Docherty's murder, as authorities realized they were dealing with a series of related crimes. Lieutenant Tate and his colleagues began examining missing person reports from the previous year, looking for patterns that might indicate additional victims of Burke and Hare's operation. The investigation was complicated by the fact that many of their victims had been individuals whose disappearances were unlikely to have been reported to authorities. Dr. Robert Knox's position became increasingly precarious as the investigation revealed his extensive business relationship with Burke and Hare. The anatomy school's records showed regular purchases of bodies from the two men, often paying premium prices for unusually fresh specimens. Knox's initial response was to deny any knowledge of criminal activity, while insisting that his body procurement procedures followed standard medical practices. The public reaction to the Burke and Hare revelations was immediate and intense, reflecting both fascination with the gruesome details of the crimes and outrage at the complicity of Edinburgh's medical establishment. Newspapers throughout Britain provided extensive coverage of the case, with particular attention to the methods used by the murderers and the failure of authorities to detect their activities, despite numerous warning signs. The legal proceedings against Burke and Hare were complicated by the Crown's decision to grant immunity to William Hare in exchange for his testimony against Burke. This prosecutorial strategy was controversial because it allowed the man who had been equally involved in the murders to escape punishment while ensuring conviction of his partner. The decision was justified on practical grounds, as Hare's testimony was essential for establishing the systematic nature of the murder operation and securing convictions that would satisfy public demands for justice. William Hare's testimony during Burke's trial provided the most detailed and authoritative account of their murder operation that would ever be available to legal authorities. Hare described their methods in clinical detail, explaining how they had developed their suffocation technique to preserve the value of corpses for anatomical dissection. He provided specific information about 16 murders, including details about victim selection, killing methods, and body disposal procedures. Hare's testimony revealed that their murder operation had been far more systematic and businesslike than authorities had initially suspected. He described how they had developed standardized procedures for identifying potential victims, luring them to the lodging house, rendering them unconscious with alcohol and laudanum, and killing them using coordinated suffocation techniques. The murders had been planned and executed with the efficiency of a commercial enterprise, rather than the passion or desperation typically associated with criminal violence. The trial testimony also exposed the extent of Dr. Knox's willful ignorance regarding the source of the bodies he purchased from Burke and Hare. Hare described multiple occasions when Knox or his assistants had commented on the unusual freshness of the corpses, while explicitly avoiding questions about how such specimens had been obtained. The anatomy school's payment procedures, which provided premium prices for the freshest bodies, had created powerful financial incentives for criminal activity. Burke's defense strategy focused on challenging Hare's credibility as a witness and arguing that any murders had been committed by Hare acting alone, while Burke was merely an unwitting accomplice in body-snatching activities. However, the physical evidence and witness testimony made it impossible to deny Burke's direct participation in at least some of the murders. The defense was further undermined by Burke's own statements during interrogation, which contained inconsistencies and admissions that supported the prosecution's case. The trial proceedings attracted unprecedented public attention, with crowds gathering outside the courthouse and extensive newspaper coverage throughout Britain and Europe. The case combined elements of horror, medical scandal, and social commentary that appealed to diverse audiences while raising serious questions about the regulation of medical education and the protection of society's most vulnerable members. Burke's conviction on charges of murder was virtually inevitable given the strength of the evidence and Hare's detailed testimony. The jury deliberated for less than an hour before returning a guilty verdict, and Burke was sentenced to death by hanging. The sentence was accompanied by the additional punishment of public dissection, a deliberate irony that would subject Burke's own body to the same treatment he had imposed on his victims. William Hare's release from custody following his testimony created significant public controversy and safety concerns. Despite his immunity agreement, many Edinburgh residents considered him equally guilty of the murders and called for vigilante justice against him. Hare was forced to leave Edinburgh under police protection and disappeared from historical records, with his ultimate fate remaining unknown. The women's legal fate was less severe but still significant. Helen McDougall was found not guilty of murder but guilty of being an accessory to criminal activities, receiving a sentence of transportation to the Australian colonies. Margaret Hare was released due to insufficient evidence of direct participation in the murders, though she also left Edinburgh and disappeared from historical documentation. Dr. Robert Knox faced no criminal charges but suffered severe professional and social consequences as a result of his association with Burke and Hare. Public outrage at his willful ignorance of obvious criminal activity led to student boycotts of his lectures, official censure from medical authorities, and eventually the effective end of his career in Edinburgh. Knox eventually left Scotland and spent his remaining years in relative obscurity, though he never admitted any wrongdoing in connection with the Burke and Hare case. The execution of William Burke on January 28, 1829, was attended by an estimated crowd of 25,000 people, making it one of the largest public executions in Scottish history. The massive turnout reflected both the public fascination with the case and the popular demand for justice following the exposure of the murder operation. Burke's behavior at his execution was described as resigned and penitent, though he maintained his innocence of some of the murders attributed to him. The public dissection of Burke's body was performed by Professor Alexander Monro at Edinburgh University, creating the ironic spectacle of the murderer being subjected to the same treatment he had imposed on his victims. The dissection was attended by medical students and members of the public, serving both educational and symbolic purposes. Burke's skeleton was preserved and remains on display at Edinburgh Medical School, where it continues to serve as a reminder of the case and its implications for medical ethics. The Burke and Hare case led to immediate reforms in the regulation of anatomical education and body procurement for medical schools. The Anatomy Act of 1832 was passed largely in response to the murders, establishing legal procedures for obtaining bodies for medical dissection while reducing the financial incentives for criminal activity. The Act allowed for the dissection of unclaimed bodies from workhouses and hospitals, providing medical schools with legal sources of anatomical specimens. The long-term impact of the Burke and Hare case on medical education was profound and lasting. Medical schools throughout Britain were forced to implement stricter oversight of body procurement procedures and to establish clear ethical guidelines for anatomical instruction. The case also contributed to growing public scrutiny of medical practices and increased demands for professional accountability within the medical community. The social impact of the murders extended far beyond medical education, influencing public attitudes toward body snatching, grave robbing, and the treatment of the dead. The case highlighted the vulnerability of society's most marginalized members and contributed to reforms in social welfare systems designed to protect elderly, disabled, and impoverished individuals from exploitation and harm. The Burke and Hare murders also had significant cultural impact, inspiring numerous works of literature, theatre, and popular entertainment that explored themes of medical ethics, social justice, and criminal psychology. The case became a standard reference point for discussions about the relationship between scientific advancement and moral responsibility, raising questions that remain relevant to contemporary debates about medical research and human experimentation. The psychological analysis of Burke and Hare's motivations and methods provided important insights into the nature of serial killing and organized criminal behavior. Their case demonstrated how ordinary individuals could become systematic murderers when economic incentives aligned with social conditions that minimized consequences for criminal activity. The systematic nature of their murders and their business-like approach to victim selection challenged contemporary understanding of criminal psychology and contributed to developing theories about the social causes of violent crime. The historical significance of the Burke and Hare case extends beyond its immediate impact on medical education and criminal justice. The murders occurred during a period of rapid social and economic change in Scotland, when traditional social structures were being disrupted by industrialization, urbanization, and immigration. The case highlighted the social tensions and institutional failures that characterized this period of transition, particularly the inadequate protection provided to society's most vulnerable members. The institutional response to the Burke and Hare revelations revealed significant problems with law enforcement, medical regulation, and social welfare systems in early 19th century Scotland. The failure to detect the murder operation, despite numerous warning signs, demonstrated the inadequacy of police resources and investigative procedures. The willingness of medical professionals to ignore obvious signs of criminal activity showed the need for stronger ethical oversight within the medical community. The economic analysis of Burke and Hare's criminal enterprise reveals how market forces and financial incentives can override moral constraints when institutional oversight is inadequate. The high prices paid for fresh corpses created powerful economic incentives for criminal activity, while the lack of questions about body sources eliminated most of the risks associated with murder for anatomical purposes. The case demonstrated the need for careful regulation of markets that involve human remains or other sensitive materials. The Burke and Hare murders also highlighted the social marginalization and vulnerability of specific populations within Edinburgh society. Their victims were overwhelmingly drawn from groups that lacked social protection and official concern: elderly pensioners, vagrant laborers, prostitutes, and individuals with disabilities. The systematic targeting of these vulnerable populations revealed the extent to which certain groups were effectively excluded from social protection and legal consideration. The gender dynamics of the Burke and Hare case were complex and significant, reflecting broader patterns of women's roles in criminal enterprises and their treatment within the legal system. Helen McDougall and Margaret Hare were essential participants in the murder operation, yet they were generally treated as subordinate figures who had been coerced or manipulated by their male partners. This interpretation reflected contemporary assumptions about women's agency and moral responsibility, while potentially obscuring their actual level of participation in the crimes. The class dimensions of the Burke and Hare case were equally important in understanding both the crimes themselves and the social response to their exposure. The murders were essentially crimes committed by poor people against other poor people for the benefit of wealthy medical institutions and their affluent students. The willingness of Edinburgh's medical establishment to ignore obvious signs of criminal activity reflected broader patterns of class privilege and the devaluation of working-class lives. The international impact of the Burke and Hare case was significant, as news of the murders spread throughout Europe and North America through newspaper coverage and official correspondence between medical institutions. The case influenced medical education practices and body procurement procedures in multiple countries, contributing to the development of international standards for anatomical instruction and medical ethics. The legal precedents established by the Burke and Hare case were important for the development of criminal law, particularly regarding conspiracy charges, accomplice testimony, and the prosecution of systematic criminal enterprises. The Crown's decision to grant immunity to Hare in exchange for his testimony established procedures that would be used in subsequent cases involving organized criminal activity. The forensic innovations prompted by the Burke and Hare investigation contributed to advancing criminal investigation techniques and medical jurisprudence. The careful documentation of crime scenes, victim identification procedures, and witness testimony established methods that would influence law enforcement practices throughout the 19th century. The case also demonstrated the importance of medical expertise in criminal investigations and the need for closer cooperation between legal and medical authorities. The Burke and Hare murders became a touchstone for debates about capital punishment, criminal justice reform, and the appropriate response to systematic criminal behavior. Burke's execution was both a demonstration of justice and a public spectacle that reflected contemporary attitudes toward punishment and deterrence. The massive public attendance at his execution revealed the complex mixture of moral outrage, entertainment, and social cohesion that surrounded capital punishment in the period. The preservation of Burke's body and skeleton for medical education created lasting ethical questions about the appropriate treatment of criminals' remains and the relationship between punishment and scientific advancement. The irony of subjecting Burke to the same treatment he had imposed on his victims was deliberate and symbolically important, but it also raised questions about the dignity of human remains and the appropriate limits of post-execution punishment. The cultural memory of the Burke and Hare case has evolved significantly over the nearly 2 centuries since the murders occurred. Initially remembered primarily as a horror story about medical school body snatching, the case has been reinterpreted through various historical lenses that emphasize different aspects of its significance. Modern analysis tends to focus on the social and economic factors that enabled the murders rather than simply condemning the individual criminals involved. The ongoing relevance of the Burke and Hare case to contemporary discussions about medical ethics, social justice, and criminal behavior ensures its continued historical significance. The fundamental questions raised by the case about the relationship between scientific advancement and moral responsibility remain relevant to modern debates about medical research, organ procurement, and the treatment of vulnerable populations in healthcare settings. The documentary evidence from the Burke and Hare case, including court records, newspaper coverage, and official correspondence, provides historians with unusually detailed information about criminal behavior, social conditions, and institutional responses in early 19th century Scotland. The case serves as a valuable window into the social tensions and ethical challenges that accompanied the modernization of medical education and the development of professional criminal investigation techniques. The Burke and Hare murders remain one of the most thoroughly documented and historically significant criminal cases in Scottish history. The systematic nature of their crimes, the complicity of respectable institutions in enabling their activities, and the social and legal responses to their exposure provide insights into the complex relationships between crime, society, and justice that continue to inform historical analysis and contemporary policy discussions. The legacy of William Burke and William Hare extends far beyond their individual crimes to encompass broader questions about social responsibility, institutional accountability, and the protection of vulnerable populations. Their case serves as a permanent reminder of how ordinary individuals can become systematic criminals when social conditions and economic incentives align to minimize moral constraints and institutional oversight. The term Burking entered the English language as a result of their case, referring to the method of suffocation they developed for killing their victims. This linguistic legacy ensures that their crimes remain part of cultural memory even when the specific details of their murders are forgotten. The persistence of this terminology reflects the lasting impact of their case on public consciousness and criminal law. The Burke and Hare murders represent a crucial moment in the development of modern medical ethics and criminal justice procedures. Their case established principles and precedents that continue to influence professional practice and legal procedure nearly 2 centuries after their crimes were committed. The fundamental questions raised by their murders about the relationship between scientific advancement and moral responsibility remain as relevant today as they were in 1828 Edinburgh.